5th century Europe was a place of chaos and disintegration and barbarian blades that fed greedily on the blood of their fallen victims. The once mighty Rome had been split in half, and whilst the eastern half retained most of its might and its dignity, the western half was seriously declining. Britannia was altogether abandoned by the Roman state. North Africa was overrun by the Vandals, and in 410 AD, Rome itself was sacked by Alaric of the Visigoths. The borders were no longer intact, and the emperors of the West could no longer protect its own citizens from the ferocious tribesmen that came rushing in from the north. But these tumultuous and gory times created ample opportunities for those hardened men who were ruthless and brave enough to seize them. One such man was Odoacer, the legendary Germanic warlord who eventually seized the entire Italian peninsula for himself and became the first king of Italy. This is the story of the man who ended the Roman Empire. Odoacer was born around 433 AD, at which point the Western Empire had been severely weakened by its losses to the Vandals in northern Africa. But Odoacer was born as an outsider to the empire. His precise place of birth remained mysterious, and we may only assume that he was born somewhere around what used to be called Pannonia, which roughly corresponds to today's Hungary. His father was Edeko, who was chieftain of the Scirii tribe and a warlord in service of Attila the Hun, who is one of the most infamous conquerors throughout all of human history. Very little is known about Odoacer's childhood and early life, but as the son of a Germanic chieftain, he was likely raised to be a warrior as well as a leader. Meanwhile, Odoacer's father, Edeko, participated as an important leader in Attila's wars of conquest, and at one point he even served as Attila's ambassador to the Eastern Roman Empire. This went on until Attila's death in 453 AD, after which Attila's entire empire fragmented into pieces. And in the following year, many Germanic tribes, such as the Scirii, rebelled against their Hunnic overlords and defeated them at the Battle of Nedau. Whether Edeko or Odoacer participated in the battle is unknown, and we have no information regarding the final fate of Edeko. Not until the 470s AD, more than a decade after the Battle of Nedau, does Odoacer reappear on the historical stage. Odoacer was now in the employ of the Western Roman Empire. He served among the Foederati, which consisted of barbarian soldiers serving under Roman command. The Roman army, at this point, had become dependent on foreign legionaries. It was no longer possible for the Romans to find ample manpower amongst their own citizens, and it was only with the help of Germanic tribesmen such as Odoacer that the dying state of Rome could be maintained. But why did the son of a Germanic chieftain become a soldier for Rome? This should be highly surprising, especially since Odoacer's father had fought for Attila, who was one of Rome's most notorious enemies of all time. But these were tumultuous times, when alliances and allegiances were constantly shifting. Joining with the Romans might have seemed like the best opportunity for Odoacer after the fall of Attila's empire, especially since Odoacer's people, the Scirii, was a small and fairly insignificant tribe compared to other tribes such as the Vandals or the Ostrogoths. Odoacer was not the only one to join with his supposed enemies during this chaotic period in history. Flavius Orestes, for example, was the son of a Roman nobleman who somehow ended up becoming the secretary of Attila the Hun. And Flavius Orestes actually accompanied Odoacer's father Edeko on his diplomatic expedition to the Eastern Roman Empire. Odoacer rose through the ranks of the Western Roman military, and by 472 AD he had become an important leader within the Foederati. At this point, it must have seemed obvious to many that the Western Roman Empire was taking its last breaths as a state. Now, I just mentioned Flavius Orestes, who had accompanied Odoacer's father Edeko on his mission to Byzantium in 449, back when they were both working for Attila the Hun. Well, at some point, Flavius Orestes had returned to the Western Roman Empire, and much like Odoacer, he achieved a very prominent position in the army. We have little to no idea of the private relationship between Odoacer and his father's old colleague. But professionally, we can speculate that Odoacer, as a high-ranking leader in the Foederati, worked directly beneath Flavius Orestes, who soon became head of the entire military. In 475, Orestes instigated a military coup against Julius Nepos, who was the second last emperor of Western Rome. Julius Nepos fled to the east, while Orestes marched on Ravenna, which had replaced Rome as the capital of the Western Empire. Orestes seized power in Ravenna and declared his own son, Romulus Augustulus, to be the new emperor of Western Rome. Romulus Augustulus, however, was a mere boy, and Orestes was the actual decision-maker during Augustulus' reign. Odoacer and Flavius Orestes worked closely together during Orestes' coup against Julius Nepos, which was supposed to be mutually beneficial. The Germanic warriors of the Foederati were promised rich lands and properties on Italian soil, but once Orestes had achieved control of the empire, he soon backtracked on his promises. Orestes refused to give his Foederati soldiers the lands which had been promised to them. This presented a golden opportunity for Odoacer. Orestes was already in a very weak position since he was not recognized by the emperor in the east, and he had almost no real legitimacy as a ruler. And he had now managed to alienate his strongest and most dangerous supporters. The Foederati rallied behind Odoacer. It's not too surprising that the Foederati warriors saw Odoacer as their real leader rather than Orestes. Odoacer was a commander in the Foederati's immediate proximity, and Odoacer, unlike Orestes, was relatable to these soldiers because of their shared Germanic background. The Foederati, who rallied behind Odoacer, were mostly Rugians, Turkilingians, Goths, and Sciirians, which was Odoacer's own tribe. These were all Germanic tribesmen, just like Odoacer, and all of them were foreigners to the Romans who ruled over them. They fought for the Roman state in order to achieve material gains, but since Orestes had failed to fulfill his promises, they had no more reasons to stay loyal to the Romans. In 476 AD, Odoacer initiated a rebellion against Flavius Orestes, just 1 year after Orestes himself had dethroned the previous emperor. Odoacer crushed the Roman army at the Battle of Piacenza in northern Italy, and then he defeated and killed Orestes during the siege of Pavia. The capital city of Ravenna fell shortly thereafter. Romulus Augustulus was captured, but Odoacer graciously decided to spare the young emperor's life, on account of the fact that Augustulus was a mere puppet ruler, and that Flavius Orestes had been the empire's actual decision-maker. Augustulus was, however, forced to abdicate as emperor. Thus, Odoacer personally ended one of the most significant empires of all of human history. Odoacer secured the Italian peninsula. He gave his warriors the lands that Orestes had denied them, and thus he secured their loyalty. But this did not necessarily mean that Odoacer was in a strong position as a ruler. Julius Nepos was still seen as the legitimate ruler by many Roman aristocrats, as well as by the emperor of the East, and the Eastern Roman Empire was the greatest threat to Odoacer's rule. Odoacer had been able to conquer the weakened Western Empire because of particular historical circumstances, but the armies of the East would remain strong for many hundreds of years. Odoacer could barely expect to win against such vastly superior armies and resources, which is why he found a brilliant diplomatic solution instead. He sent a messenger to the eastern capital city of Constantinople, and the messenger brought with him the imperial regalia of the West, which were gifted to the Eastern Emperor. Odoacer, the messenger explained, had no intention of usurping the imperial throne, not like that pretender Flavius Orestes, whom Odoacer had recently brought to justice. Odoacer merely intended to rule for the Eastern Emperor, and Julius Nepos would still be regarded as the official ruler. Emperor Zeno of the East decided to agree to Odoacer's arrangement. This consensus was a huge relief to Odoacer as well as Emperor Zeno. The western borders were now secured, and Odoacer's official deference to Emperor Zeno greatly increased Zeno's own prestige and legitimacy as an emperor. Odoacer was named patrician by Emperor Zeno, and he was legitimized as the de facto ruler of Italy. He made sure to never call himself emperor, and instead styled himself Rex Italiae, or King of Italy. Odoacer, therefore, is known to history as the first ever King of Italy. Odoacer may have been a foreign invader who had seized power by force, but compared to many of the late Roman emperors, he was actually a huge improvement. He stabilized the Italian economy, and he was just as balanced and diplomatic on domestic issues as he was on foreign policy. First of all, he had to secure the support from his own kinsmen in the Foederati, which he achieved by giving them the lands that they had previously been promised. But the majority of Italy was overwhelmingly Roman, and they were also Nicene Christians, unlike Odoacer and many of his Foederati, which caused yet another rift between Odoacer and his subjects. But Odoacer, despite the fact that he believed in Arianism rather than Nicene Christianity, still decided to respect the Christian majority. He practiced religious tolerance, and he did not interfere with the activities of the Roman Church. He even used public funds for the upkeep of the churches. This attitude of respect and tolerance extended to other areas of civic life as well. The Roman administration was maintained, as was also the Roman Senate and the social status of the Roman elite. What matters even more is that the Roman laws were actively upheld so that ordinary people could feel safe and protected. This all meant that many Roman citizens actually were much better off during Odoacer's rule than they had previously been. Odoacer's reign was remarkably peaceful, except possibly for when he seized Dalmatia with minimal resistance in 480, and when he secured the northern border against the Ragians in 487. But the same cannot be said for the reign of Odoacer's superior in the east. Emperor Zeno had to face almost constant turbulence as a ruler. He had to deal with the Saurians and Ostrogoths and Huns, as well as many other internal and external enemies. One of the most significant external threats to Emperor Zeno's reign was the Ostrogoths. The Ostrogoths were a powerful Germanic nation, much mightier and more numerous than the Scirii. Their leader was Theodoric, who later became known as Theodoric the Great. King Theodoric had a complicated relationship to the Byzantine Empire. At times, he was their lauded ally, who helped secure the northern borders in the Balkans. At times, he himself breached these borders and led plundering expeditions into Byzantine territory. Emperor Zeno had come to see King Theodoric as more and more of a threat, and he had begun to view Odoacer in the same way, ever since Odoacer had seized Dalmatia in 480. In order to relieve his empire of both of these threats, Emperor Zeno came up with a brilliant solution. He pitted Theodoric and Odoacer against each other. He encouraged Theodoric to invade Odoacer's kingdom and offered him to become his new vassal ruler over Italy. Theodoric and his army crossed the river Isonzo in today's Slovenia in 489 AD and entered Odoacer's territory. He was immediately greeted with spears, longswords, and a storm of arrows. Odoacer's army consisted of various Germanic groups, as well as of Italian soldiers, and an overwhelming majority of his men were soldiers on foot. Theodoric's army, on the other hand, was predominantly Ostrogothic and had a much stronger emphasis on its cavalry. Odoacer lost the Battle of Isonzo and fled west to the north of Italy. He then regrouped at Verona, where he once again offered resistance to the invading Ostrogoths, but to no avail. Theodoric won a decisive victory at the Battle of Verona, and Odoacer was no longer in a position where he could offer resistance on the open field. Instead, he took refuge in the fortified city of Ravenna. Ravenna was ideally suited for a siege. She had strong walls, fortified gates and towers, and access to the Adriatic Sea, which meant that the city could be resupplied from the outside. She also had strong natural defenses in the boggy marshlands that surrounded her. These swamps could easily trap both horses and men, and they made it almost impossible to transport siege towers and other heavy siege weapons to the gates of the city. Theodoric besieged Ravenna for almost 3 years, from 490 to 493 AD. Odoacer and his men held out bravely until he finally opted for a diplomatic solution. Odoacer suggested that he and Theodoric should make peace, and that the two of them should become joint rulers of the Italian kingdom. Theodoric seemingly agreed to these terms, and the siege of Ravenna was ended. 10 days later, on March 15, 493 AD, Theodoric invited Odoacer to a banquet to celebrate their reconciliation and the future of their partnership. The banquet began pleasantly, with serving of wine and lavish meals, and possibly with a toast to the new peace. But then, Theodoric suddenly leaped from his seat, sword in hand, and dealt a powerful blow to the unsuspecting Odoacer. Odoacer was struck down and assassinated in cold blood by Theodoric himself, in full view of the entire realm. Thus ended the man who had ended the Roman Empire.